So the next thing we're going to talk about is environmental policy, and how we decide on and act on environmental policy. So policies are just principles that guide in setting goals, decisions, and activities, right? So we have a particular goal in mind. Here is Richard Nixon signing the Clean Air Act back in the 60s. The goal is clean air. How are we going to get there? What kind of activities are we going to do in order to get there? So environmental policies are just policies that guide decisions and actions that influence the environment. They are achieved via regulation, right? So whether that's basically we pass a regulation saying you cannot do this practice that is polluting anymore. Incentives, which can be, for example, when the government gave rebates to people who are buying fuel-efficient cars. You can do partnerships between a variety of government agencies or nonprofits and businesses. And then also volunteerism. You can encourage certain approaches to the environment on a volunteer basis. And there are those that would argue that it should almost be entirely volunteerism. Some issues surrounding enacting environmental policy. There are kind of 8 of them, but the first is government versus individual control, or what level of government controls that issue. So, for example, should it be up to you? Should it be a personal choice? Should the government step in and make you practice something, right? We all want to encourage people to have, use less water, but should the government actually regulate, how much water you're using, or should that be up to you individually? Competing public values. So, for example, do we want logging jobs, right, from cutting down trees, or do we want to leave the trees in order to preserve that watershed? Again, Hetch Hetchy is a great example of this, right? Do we want to have that water supply for San Francisco, or do we want to preserve that valley? That valley. For some reason today I cannot say valley. Uncertainty and action, which goes along with the precautionary principle, which is, in a sense, saying that you want to act even if you are not sure it could cause a problem, right? Is there any evidence that it could cause a problem, right? So some people say that hydraulic fracturing, right, a lot of the issues around hydraulic fracturing, how we extract natural gas, there's not any kind of proven harm from it. A lot of other people say we should regulate this before it even started because it should be heavily regulated because it has the potential to cause problems. So a lot of this uncertainty leads to inaction. In addition, kind of which level of the government decides. If you decide it's in government control, is it federal, is it state, is it county, is it city? There's questions of which government agency has jurisdiction. Many agencies overlap for the same system. For example, if you have a river with levees and dams, you can have multiple agencies. In my research, kind of looking in San Diego County at environmental policy, there's a lot of confusion over whether or not it is a federal issue, a state issue, a county issue, a city issue, or all of the above. Protection against selfish actions. We talked about tragedy of the commons in the last chapter. So here's an example of, how do you prevent kind of overgrazing that's happening when it's kind of in everybody's best interest to just keep grazing until that runs out. And then what is the best means to an end? So very often the goal is agreed upon, but the issue is what is the acceptable strategy. So, should we heavily regulate carbon, or should we use a market-based carbon credit approach. And people will argue about that acceptable strategy, and then very often that will lead to inaction. And then also political power relationships. Here we have our representations of the Republican and Democratic parties in our country, which don't agree on much these days, right? So kind of, do you get to have political compromises? Which political parties in the majority? And then also regional issues, especially in the United States, we have many areas that are heavily Republican versus heavily Democrat. And so this is the last thing I'm going to talk about today, but just thinking about how kind of laws are made in the United States. We have three branches of the government, which hopefully you have learned in a U.S. history class or a government class at some point. We have the executive branch, which is the office of the president. We have the legislative branch, which includes Congress, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives. And then we have the judicial branch, which is not just the Supreme Court, but all courts. And so Congress passes laws that are then enacted and signed by the executive branch. And then the president appoints judges with congressional approval. The courts rule on the constitutionality of legislation, so that's how the courts get involved. Also, Congress approves budgets and executive appointments to see kind of how those are going to play out. Courts rule on the appropriate interpretation and enforcement of laws, and Congress approves judicial appointments and may remove judges by impeachment. So this is a checks and balance system that is present in the U.S. government, which some people have argued that this checks and balance has led to a lot of inaction due to the fact that they're always kind of checking one another, sometimes more effectively than other times. But for example, the Clean Air Act, which I mentioned earlier, basically charges the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, with regulating pollutants to air. And courts ruled that greenhouse gases that cause climate change are, in fact, pollutants. That was a big question. Are they or not pollutants? And so now those greenhouse gases fall under the purview of the Environmental Protection Agency. But you have a variety of branches of the government kind of involved in this one process. So that is the end of the lecture for Chapter 2. You're going to go on and watch that documentary about Wangari Maathai. You're going to complete your writing exercise for this chapter, this module, and then take your quiz.